Hello and welcome to Follow the Money. I'm Raine Musñgi. Join us as we explore the tools and insights you need to jumpstart your financial journey. Strong AI policies and targeted investments are now seen as essential to accelerating the Philippines' adoption of artificial intelligence, especially in sectors like banking, insurance, and e-commerce. The country currently leads globally in individual AI use, but institutional adoption still lags, creating risks and missed economic opportunities. Now, as Asia's banks face mounting fraud, climate risk, and MSME credit gaps, the Philippines must decide whether to lead or lag behind in the AI revolution. Today on Follow the Money, we're joined by Dr. David Hardoon, Global Head of AI at Standard Chartered and a key voice in shaping the role of artificial intelligence across the banking world. David, pleasure to have you and welcome to Follow the Money.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. David, you're a data scientist, and what caught our attention up front is your call to action for AI adoption in the Philippines, that it needs policy and pesos. Can you tell us more about that?
No, absolutely. Well, you just said something very interesting, that the Philippines is one of the leaders in terms of individual AI adoption. So that shows you that there is a demand. There is almost like a calling from the population. Now, why there's a need for policy? Because in the end of the day, all of these capabilities rides on infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just referring to the good old, technology layers, which is also necessary, but infrastructure also in terms of people capabilities and skill sets. That is essentially driven, in my opinion, by policy, by setting policy of investment, by setting a policy of development, of setting policy in terms of targeted skill sets, education capabilities.
Digging a little deeper, is there a level of investment, specifically in pesos and value, that might be required for Philippine businesses to effectively integrate AI into their operations, in your experience?
Well, Raine, that is a very good question, but yet a very difficult one. And I'll tell you why it's a difficult one. Because if you are, let's say, a small, medium enterprise, and quite the degree of AI capability is in terms of, let's say, summarizing and analyzing the emails that you receive in terms of orders, or quickly providing a projections. We're quite frankly, not that recommending any particular vendor, but there are many cloud providers from AWS, Azure, et cetera, and others, where you can subscribe to services and subscribe to those type of capabilities. That is not a big ticket item. We're talking about a couple of thousand pesos, 10,000 pesos. However, if you're a large organization, well, of course, that may go into the millions, tens of millions, when you're really thinking about incorporating technology within your organization. And then, of course, when you move into government and you're thinking about, let's say, investing in terms of infrastructure from data centers, encouraging companies, tax breaks, that can go in terms of the hundreds of millions, if not billions. But all of this pays back, and that's something that's really important. It's an upfront investment for a midterm and long-term gain because it has a direct impact from an economic point of view. It results in productivity, it results in efficiency, and it results in services that can be delivered to customers. And if I may just give you one simple example from the Philippines, from institutions that have used it, it was in the financial services. They found that using an AI capability solution resulted in 450% improvement in convergence. In other words, there was an ability of getting 4.5 more customers than not using AI. That is pesos in the pocket.
It sounds good and very specific. And of course, you already mentioned government, but are there other sectors in the Philippines most critical to integrate AI into their systems immediately to maximize economic benefits?
Well, obviously, one of the, I would argue, as I've been part of the financial sector, at the end of the day, it's, money makes the world go round. And it's a massive driver in terms of adoption, motivation, and through financial institutions seeking to adopt you, that will spur up the second-degree market of the underlying providers. However, there is a greater opportunity, which is actually education. I would argue should not be looked over, both in terms of providers. Right now, I'm sitting in Singapore, and you would find there's a massive industry of providing education from certifications all the way to courses, degrees in that particular field. And then, of course, the institutions themselves. And then, of course, thirdly, which, again, it should not be a neglected area and has a significant implication, is healthcare. This directly impacts actually not just productivity, but longevity. And moving from the world of healthcare, which a lot of times is sick there, to genuinely healthcare and proactively supporting the health of the population and the ability to, well, enjoy and be productive. So as you can see on the screen. So these are areas which are of immense ability. And then finally, as it's propagating onwards, you will find that everyone can benefit, even in the agriculture. But again, the agriculture will be somewhat different, let's say, from financial services, which is much more technology-oriented than others.
Well, as former CEO of Aboitiz Data Innovation, are there key insights you gained about the challenges? I mean, you already outlined some of the opportunities, but what about the challenges in AI adoption in the Philippines?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, as I was kind of alluding earlier, is that it's an upfront investment for midterm to long-term benefit. Notice I skipped the word immediate. That's because there's a lot of infrastructure work. There's an entire term called technical debt, which I won't get into too much detail into it, which means, well, just because we want to have a train running at a bullet speed train, that because we want to enjoy the scenery, but if we don't have that infrastructure to support it, it's simply aspirational. It needs to be put in place in order to achieve that. We will get that benefit downstream. That is a challenge. And it's also a challenge of how do we start? And if I may jump into solutioning, the good thing is there's a tremendous amount of Filipinos which are working in these industries, both inside Philippines for foreign companies as well as outside Philippines. This is a great opportunity to come back and leverage on those expertise to deploy and accelerate those adoptions so that gap can become a lot smaller.
Those gaps in infrastructure, where are they exactly? Where do we start with that?
Well, the first and foremost one is connectivity. I mean, there needs to be a bandwidth of just like connecting online or enjoying the world of Netflix. Same thing when it comes to AI. And as one says, AI doesn't operate without data. Data also means connectivity. Now, again, Philippines has already been doing tremendous improvements. If you look at what's been happening over the COVID duration with telebanking, telemedicine to a certain degree, but that has to continue. Not just the metropolitan areas or the center of population, it's across the Philippines. Philippines is a very broad, diverse country. Those investments need to happen. Secondly, as I mentioned, in terms of people, having the availability of people with the skill sets and knowledge in terms of how to start rolling out these type of technical as well as soft skills, because what you find is AI also start changing the nature of processes and services that can be delivered. Those, to me, are the two key ones. You address these, everything else will start to fall into place.
Falling into place, what kind of AI growth trajectory could the Philippines see in the next 5 years, considering current adoption rates and infrastructure?
Well, a bit of crystal ball gazing. However, if those infrastructure and people aspects are addressed, I would be extremely bullish with the Philippines. Philippines was one of the very first early adopters in Facebook, so social media. If, you know, the running element of statistics is what is just under 126 million Filipinos. You almost have a double to triple number of the mobile phones. There is that readiness. It's a young population willing to try, willing to adopt, willing to go the mile, and there's a need. There's an opportunity to bring on board the formal financial services, those who are not. There's an opportunity to provide medicine care at the level that can be provided to all. There is that opportunity. So I would be very bullish. If those core elements are addressed, if those investments are done, I won't be surprised if you would find Philippines, well, perhaps maybe not quite yet at the level of Singapore, because Singapore has been investing quite heavily over the last 20 years, but running up against some of the other competitors within across the ASEAN market.
And considering that AI has been more developed in countries like Singapore and even Hong Kong and China, of course, and you're with Standard Chartered, you've taken an active role in AI enablement. How do you see this translating to emerging markets like the Philippines?
Oh, it's cascades immediately. So, for example, in the role that I play in global development enablement, is appearing in markets in Africa. Obviously, we have a presence in the Philippines. And the goal is how to provide those services, how to provide those capabilities that are enhanced through AI, be it in the back end or in the front end, to all markets, to all providers. And what the hope would be is that will create a cascade to other players, be it local players or other internationals in those markets. So I'm personally very bullish. I mean, but then again, I come from the world of AI. I have to be. I call it pragmatically optimistic. But at the end of the day, it's like when people, again, roll back the clock 10 years ago, who were very skeptical about electric vehicles. It is about the ability of adopting it, ability to put the willingness in the underlying infrastructure and capability, which is, by the way, also very true for Philippines, as you're seeing the investment which is happening in terms of, for example, chargers. So I think there is a phenomenal opportunity. The question is the willingness to capitalize on it.
Mm-hmm. And we're actually looking at some of the video from your bank. Are there lessons that can be drawn from standard chartered AI developments in Singapore, deployments, or even in the UK that might apply to Philippine digital banks?
No, absolutely. And in fact, the most, I think, important and pertinent one is that there's a bit of a mindset of like, oh, security, governance, controls, inhibits innovation, or to do innovation, we need to kind of be more ginger and minimal on that. And the answer is absolutely not. In fact, one can be even more aggressive in innovations with proper governance, proper infra-security, proper cybersecurity. And that's exactly what you're finding due also the complexity of such an organization operating across multiple jurisdictions. And I really want to take that message home, because I know also there's conversations in the Philippines with respect to regulation and so forth. I am a big proponent and a supporter, of these type of approaches, because at the end of the day, it creates clarity. It creates a framework of how to do it right. Not to do it, but to do it right in a way that benefits all participants and all players. That, to me, would be the biggest lesson. It can be done, it should be done, and how to gain the benefits. And in fact, now you can learn from others and not repeat potential learnings that had to be gone through.
So we're lagging behind, but if you're saying that as long as we do it right, then it's going to be worth it. But what's the cost of inaction? How exposed are Philippine banks if AI investment continues to lag behind the region?
You said something which I would advocate all to think about in terms of the cost of inaction. In fact, many times we don't calculate the cost of inaction. We try and estimate, and save the pesos, which obviously we should, but we don't calculate the cost of inaction. We absolutely should. And I would argue, the more you wait, you would find that the gap will only exponentially increase. It's already growing significantly, but it can be met. For example, allow me to give you an example from across the region, Vietnam. Vietnam was pretty much in the same level in terms of technological adoption and AI and so forth. Now, not only is it very kind of on top of the ladder, you're finding that, in fact, whether it's Vietnamese or non-Vietnamese are migrating into Vietnam to be part of the digital journey and their adoption. So the cost of inaction, not to be a fearmonger, I would say would be very detrimental, because the gap is just going to get wider and wider and wider. It's not something that's been beneficial, especially if one wants to progress, not just as an individual, which Philippines is a great adopter from that point of view, but as a cohort, as a barangay, as a city, as a full economy, participating in a regional and global one.
Among the sectors in society, who are the immediate and most benefited sector for AI in terms of financial inclusion? Should the Philippines prioritize AI for financial inclusion, particularly in narrowing the MSME credit gap, or is this really more beneficial for the wealthier set?
It is absolutely beneficial for the mass market, for the micro, small, medium enterprises. And in fact, one of the reasons these days, I don't even use the word inclusion, I call it sustainability and to bring people on board. Because now there's an opportunity to answer those financial questions of risk assessment, credit viability, by using alternative means through AI underlying solutions. It's something which is absolutely beneficial. And again, don't need to take my word for it. Look at China. Look at how they leapfrog, using data and using AI. Look what happened to India, what's happening in India. And I wouldn't be surprised for some of the countries in Africa, Kenya and others, you would see the exact same thing. So I would almost advocate that I wouldn't be so worried as much of the gap per se, other than the fact that I wouldn't want it to increase, but I would see it more as an opportunity that you don't have to take the same path that everyone has done. You could leapfrog. You can learn what Hong Kong and China have done. You can learn from what Singapore has done. You can learn from Vietnam. You can learn from when go like, okay, how do we now jump from maybe not A to Z, but we can go from A to F as fast as possible, getting those benefits and providing those opportunities to the many out there.
Without having to reinvent the wheel. Now, insurers and regulators around the world are calling for human-centered AI. What does that look like? And can Philippine banks actually invest in human-centered AI?
No, absolutely. I constantly remind people that AI is not done for the sake of AI. It's done to support us. So it always has to be centered around us. Even if there's an quote unquote automated procedure, it is to benefit either as a part of a process or as an underlying end outcome. So yes, what I would although advocate is that it's not that unique or different. It's really about saying, again, let me give you an example. I love examples of using AI, let's say an audit and tax calculation, resulted in 1,000 hours reduced of effort. Now, you may go, well, but that's not human-centered AI. I would say, no, it is, because now the tax team are able to go home on time. They're able to spend their time focusing on the more complex issues that they just simply have the capacity to do earlier. And that's a very simple example. So I'm absolutely an advocate that it must be done from that perspective, and it's just common sense.
You mentioned earlier that there has to be some upskilling required to be able to deploy AI across the country, especially our 7,500 islands. Do banks need to work with government to build AI talent and infrastructure here? Or, can we not rely on just BPO upskilling?
Well, you have obviously a prolific BPO industry, which is fantastic, and I would be silly not to leverage on it. Having said that, is why just only take one path? Financial institutions themselves need to focus on upskilling. And when I say upskilling, I don't say like everyone has to become a data scientist. Actually, no. It's how to use data. It's how to use the outcomes, the outputs, and the programs that are based on AI, for example. And then from a government perspective, because as you're seeing in other countries, again, if I use the analogy, they're deploying these kind of trainings and skill sets. By the way, not all of them even have the category AI. Some of them is critical thinking. Some of them is problem solving, all the way to tertiary education. And that's something that's obviously within the premise and the oversight of the government. So it does require that involvement and oversight, again, as a national strategy, not just a corporate one. The three should go hand in hand.
All right, we have to pause for a few reminders, but we'll be back with Dr. Hardoon in a moment. We'll discuss with him how the AI leadership race in ASEAN is heating up. Stay on BNC and follow the money.
The questions that matter, the answers you deserve.
This is where ideas clash, visions collide, and perspective change.
Join us live, unfiltered, uncompromising.
Your opinion counts.
Abogado, Thursday,
8:30 p.m. only on Bilyonaryo News Channel.
Anton Rojas, Erica Christensen. The Scorecard, 9:30 p.m. on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel. Pinky Web, On Point, 7:30 p.m. on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.
Welcome back to Follow the Money. We're still with Dr. David Hardoon, Global Head of AI at Standard Chartered. David, the Philippines, as we mentioned earlier, leads the world in individual AI usage, as according to Microsoft. But how do we close the institutional gap?
The way we go about institutional gap is, actually, which is kind of funny to a certain extent, is the individuals who are using it for their own benefits and purposes should, I don't want to say the word demand, but start requesting these kind of capabilities, these kind of services, this type of level of service from institution. In the end of the day, one of the biggest drivers is consumer demand. And so the moment the consumers start pushing it, it will happen. That's number one. Number two, for the leaders out there who realize, as yourself, as you've mentioned there, in terms of the consumption and so forth, is that this is something that is, I don't like using the word future-proofing because I don't believe the future can ever be proof, but future-readying, preparing yourself to what is going to come. And this is only going to become a more digital, more data-driven, a more technological-based society. As I was kind of mentioning in an earlier question, there is a technological gap, a technical debt, as I refer to it. Better start addressing it now rather than having one which is a lot more substantial. The one, consumer drive, I would say as a consumer, just raise, why don't we do it? And then when we as employees work in a company, it's simply pushing it from the bottom up of why aren't we doing that as a part of our services, a part of capabilities. It has to be the two, grassroots, top down, and because one cannot forget the government is incentivization. If the government really does want to make a drive and a change, there are many levers and many mechanisms of incentivization in order to make it worthwhile for companies to try those type of elements and mitigate their risks.
So you mentioned data already. There's a lot of pushback against, the development of many data centers, even here in the Philippines. Apparently, there's a lot of environmental cost to it as well. In your work, do you have an eye on environmental compliance or standards? Can AI be embedded into climate risk models for banks and insurers or any institution, really? And how?
The answer is a resounding yes. In fact, you find that be it insurance companies or risk models are now using more prolific AI-based capabilities to incorporate things from weather change, flooding. And interestingly, you find it also not just insurance, others, but for example, infrastructure. When you're going about building an infrastructure, let's say a road, using AI to start identifying the potential, let's say, flood risk. That goes into the design of the road so that you're not just building it for now, you're building it for the future. So the answer is absolutely. And then equally is identifying the viability of it. So for example, from experimentation, how to run it in a more optimal way that is more environmental friendly and also understand the implication that one may have. So in the end of the day, there is value. It's not just an abstract kind of concept in terms of understanding how to the potential impacts, how it could be beneficial for us, and how to underline use it. These are all things that can be done. And then your first part of your question in terms of data centers, my personal view, and I'll emphasize that, is one of pragmatism. I believe in not reinventing the wheel. There's already a proliferation of availability and access to the Philippines as well as to other countries. Maximize those. If as part of that maximization there is a need, by all means. But, don't, as Kevin Costner movie, don't build the field and hope they will come. Use the field, use the value, demonstrate it, and then leverage on it even further.
David, you've spent a lot of time here in the Philippines and worked with government as well as the private institutions. And as we can see, the National Economic Development Authority does have a plan for integrating AI and rolling it out even more aggressively. But do you think the Philippines needs a national AI council or perhaps an independent oversight body to guide responsible, scalable implementation?
Well, I wouldn't be the wiser to advise Philippines in terms of how best to take the approach. My personal view is it has to be a combination. Obviously, as we were kind of discussing earlier, having a government-driven based approach is good. It's important because at the end of the day, the industry does look at the government for stability and for consistency. So on one hand, yes. Having said that, I don't think companies should take the attitude of, oh, let's wait until the government does it, or let's wait until one is established. So if you believe it's important, which obviously I believe it too, situate your own council, which eventually could harmonize, for example, with a national one if it's put in place. The long and short of it is start. Don't wait. Because the reality is, the longer you wait, the more you will find that investments will need to be done, the more the gaps will take. And again, being very pragmatic, is there'll be competitors that will pop up that may already from the onset start adopting these capabilities and would have that value add. Again, to your point, Philippines consumers on an individual basis are the largest consumers of AI. That should tell you something. That should really tell you in terms of what resonates ultimately with the consumer base.
Lots of insight from David that we need to parse through, but obviously the Philippines needs to move quickly with both regulation and investment to turn its grassroots AI enthusiasm into real institutional leadership or risk being left behind. Thank you so much, Dr. David Hardoon, Global Head of AI at Standard Chartered, joining us and weighing in on the future of AI in the Philippines. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Now, before we go, we leave you with this thought from the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Rajiv Shah. AI is the electricity of the 21st century, and it must power inclusive growth and not widen divides. And that is it for today's edition of Follow the Money. I'm Raine Musñgi. Thank you so much for watching. See you again tomorrow. Keep it here on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel, always on time.